There is a single act in the Pacific War so reckless, so violently improbable, that military historians still debate whether any sane man would have attempted it. On April 13, 1945, one exhausted American sergeant ran out of bullets, stared into the dark at a wave of advancing Japanese infantry, and made a choice that defied every written rule of explosives handling, every combat manual, every instinct of self-preservation. What he did in the next 17 minutes saved an entire defensive line from collapse, killed more than 24 enemy soldiers, and created a tactic so deadly that it was immediately and permanently forbidden by the United States Army. This is not a story about bravery. This is a story about calculation at the edge of death. The tomb smelled of earth and old bones and the acrid burn of spent rifle powder. Technical Sergeant Buford T. Anderson pressed his back against the limestone wall, feeling the cool dampness seep through his uniform, and tried to count how many rounds he had left without looking. His fingers moved across the cloth bandolier by touch alone. 3 clips. 24 rounds. Maybe less. The math was bad. The noise outside was worse. Anderson was 24 years old, born in a small town in Washington state that most people had never heard of, and he had been in the Pacific for 18 months. He had landed on Leyte, survived the fighting in the mountains where the rain never stopped and men rotted from the inside out with jungle diseases that had no names. He had made sergeant because the previous sergeant had stepped on a mine, and he had made technical sergeant because he was competent and calm and did not panic when the mortar started falling. These were not remarkable qualities. They were simply the minimum requirements for staying alive long enough to be promoted. The Army had taught him to operate the M2 mortar, to calculate range and deflection, to adjust fire based on terrain and wind, and he had become very good at it because being good at your job meant that your squad stayed alive. That was the entire philosophy of survival distilled to its essence. Competence equals breathing. Kakazu Ridge rose like a broken tooth from the Okinawan landscape, a natural fortress of coral limestone honeycombed with caves, tombs, and tunnel systems that the Japanese had spent months fortifying. The Americans had taken the southern slope 2 days earlier, paying for every meter in blood, and now they clung to it while the Japanese 272nd Independent Infantry Battalion prepared to take it back. Anderson's mortar squad had been shelling enemy positions since dawn, dropping 60mm rounds into the ravines and tree lines where Imperial Army soldiers gathered in the shadows. The M2 mortar was a simple weapon, a tube and a base plate, efficient and light enough for 3 men to carry broken down across rough ground. They had fired until the base plate cracked, until the traverse mechanism seized from dust and heat, and then they had dragged the tube into this tomb and waited for orders that never came. The orders should have come hours ago. The company commander was dead, killed by a sniper while moving between positions, and the executive officer had taken a piece of shrapnel to the neck and been evacuated unconscious on a stretcher. The lieutenant who had replaced him was 22 years old and had arrived on Okinawa 6 days earlier, fresh from officer candidate school, and he had looked at the tactical situation on Kakazu Ridge with the kind of wide-eyed confusion that suggested he had not fully absorbed the fact that people here were actively trying to kill him. He had ordered Anderson's squad to hold the tomb, to maintain observation on the approaches, and to await further instructions. That had been at 1400 hours. It was now past 2100, and the only instruction that mattered was the sound of enemy infantry moving uphill in the darkness. The tomb was an old one, carved into the ridgeline by Okinawan families generations dead. A rectangular chamber barely large enough for 5 men if they sat with their knees drawn up. The entrance faced north, a low opening that forced a man to crouch, and beyond it lay a shallow depression choked with wild grass and shattered coral. Anderson could see perhaps 30 yards before the ground dropped away into darkness. The rest of his squad was scattered along the tomb. Private First Class Leland, who was 19 and had not spoken in 2 hours. Corporal Hastings, who kept checking his rifle bolt with shaking hands. Private Dominguez, who was trying to sleep and failing. The 5th man, a replacement whose name Anderson had never learned, had been hit by a sniper that morning and now lay further down the ridge under a poncho, waiting for graves registration. These were the men Anderson was responsible for. Not the entire American line, not the strategic objectives outlined in the operations order, not the grand sweep of history. Just 4 exhausted soldiers who wanted to see sunrise. That was the reality of command at the squad level. Everything else was abstraction. The Japanese attack began just after nightfall with no preliminary barrage, no signal, just the sudden crack of rifle fire and the high shriek of a whistle somewhere in the valley below. Anderson heard the sound and felt his stomach tighten. They were coming uphill, moving fast, using the darkness and the terrain. He could hear boots scrabbling on loose stone, the clink of equipment, voices calling in Japanese, sharp and controlled. They were close, too close. He moved to the entrance and looked out. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough light to distinguish rock from shadow, but he could see movement now, low shapes flowing upward through the grass like water rising. 40 meters. 35. He raised his M1 Garand and fired 3 shots at the nearest shape, working the trigger smoothly, feeling the rifle buck and settle. The shape dropped and did not move. Another replaced it almost immediately. He fired again, and the rifle's internal magazine clicked empty with that distinctive metallic ping that every Japanese soldier on Okinawa had learned to recognize as an invitation. Anderson dropped below the entrance, pulled a fresh clip from his bandolier, and thumbed it into the receiver. The N-block clip seated with a snap. 8 more rounds. He was breathing too fast. He forced himself to slow it down, to count the breaths, to think. Leland fired a long burst from the corner of the entrance, the muzzle flash lighting up the tomb's interior in sharp orange pulses, and Anderson smelled the cordite and the limestone dust that the concussion shook loose from the ceiling. Leland's rifle went silent. Reloading. Hastings fired twice, missed, fired again. Anderson could hear him whispering something, a prayer or a count, impossible to tell. Dominguez was awake now, crouched against the back wall with his rifle across his knees and his eyes very wide. The first grenade came in low and fast, a dark egg-shaped blur that hit the ground 2 meters outside the entrance and detonated with a sound like a steel door slamming shut. The blast wave rolled into the tomb, hot and stinking of chemicals, and Anderson felt the pressure change in his ears. Fragments hissed against the limestone. Someone outside was shouting orders. Another grenade arced through the air, and this one came through the entrance cleanly, bouncing once on the stone floor before rolling toward the back wall where Dominguez sat frozen. Anderson moved without thinking. He lunged forward, scooped the grenade with his right hand, and threw it back out through the entrance in a single continuous motion. It detonated in midair 3 meters beyond the tomb. A sharp yellow flash and a sound like cloth tearing, and someone screamed. The scream cut off abruptly. Anderson's hand was numb. He looked down and saw that his palm was bleeding where the grenade serrations had cut the skin. He wiped it on his trousers and picked up his rifle. The Japanese were right on top of them now. Anderson could see them clearly despite the darkness, moving figures silhouetted against the lesser black of the sky. 10 or 15 men advancing in a loose line, rifles leveled. He fired 4 shots in rapid succession, 1, 2, 3, 4, and saw 2 men fall. The bolt locked back. Empty. He reloaded his last clip and knew with absolute certainty that 8 rounds would not be enough. The math was simple and terrible. Too many targets, too little ammunition, no fallback position, no support. The ridgeline behind them was open ground. If they left the tomb, they would be cut down in seconds. If they stayed, the enemy would grenade them or simply push inside and finish it with bayonets. Anderson had seen what bayonets did to men. He had walked through a position on Leyte where the Japanese had overrun an American platoon at night, and the bodies had been arranged in ways that suggested the killing had continued long after resistance ended. He had no intention of letting that happen here. But intention without means was just wishful thinking, and the means were draining away with every second. Leland fired his last rounds and threw his rifle down. Hastings was fumbling with a grenade, trying to pull the pin, but his hands were shaking too badly. Anderson fired his remaining 8 shots slowly, deliberately, picking targets with care, and when the rifle pinged empty, he let it fall across his lap and looked around the tomb for anything, any weapon, any option. That was when he saw the crate. It was shoved against the far wall beneath a tangle of equipment and empty ration cartons. A wooden box stenciled with faded black letters. 60mm M2 high explosive shells for the mortar they had dragged up here and abandoned when the baseplate failed. Anderson stared at the crate and felt something shift in his mind. some desperate gear engaging. The shells were useless without the mortar. Except they were not. They were still explosive. They still had fuses. And he understood, in a single cold flash of comprehension, exactly what those fuses were designed to do. The M2 mortar shell was a simple device, barely more sophisticated than a grenade. A steel body filled with composition B explosive, a percussion fuse screwed into the nose, and a tail fin assembly with a shotgun primer at the base. When the primer struck the firing pin at the bottom of the mortar tube, it ignited a small charge that launched the shell, and the sudden acceleration armed the nose fuse by releasing a spring-loaded striker. Upon impact, the fuse detonated the main charge. Effective blast radius approximately 27 meters. The key word was impact. The shell armed in flight and detonated when it hit something solid. Anderson pulled the crate open. 16 shells nested inside, each one roughly the length of his forearm, surprisingly heavy. He lifted one out and turned it over in his hands, examining it in the faint light. The nose fuse assembly was intact, the safety wire still wrapped around the striker pin. Standard procedure required the wire to remain in place until the shell was loaded into the tube. Standard procedure assumed the shell would be fired, not thrown. He looked at the wire and then at the limestone wall beside him, rough and hard, and he thought, impact. The plan formed in his mind fully realized and completely insane. He would arm the shells manually by striking them against the stone hard enough to release the striker mechanism, then throw them like grenades at the advancing Japanese. The explosion radius was sufficient to kill or wound anyone within 27 meters. The danger was that the same explosion would kill him if he misjudged the throw, if the shell detonated on contact with the ground too close, if the fuse activated prematurely, if his arm failed, if anything went wrong in any of a dozen ways. The M2 shell weighed over 3 pounds. Throwing it any significant distance would be difficult. Throwing it accurately while under fire in darkness would be nearly impossible. Throwing it 16 times without a single mistake would be suicidal. He looked at Leland, at Hastings, at Dominguez pressed against the back wall, and he thought about the replacement whose name he had never learned, lying cold under a poncho on the hillside. He thought about the Japanese infantry 20 meters away, regrouping for the final push, and he thought about the fact that in approximately 60 seconds this tomb would become a killing box and there was absolutely nothing else he could do to prevent it. The shells were a weapon. They were the only weapon left. And Anderson had not survived 18 months in the Pacific by ignoring available resources when the alternative was death. He did it anyway. Anderson removed the safety wire from the first shell and held it by the tail fin assembly with his right hand. He took a breath, drew his arm back, and swung the shell forward, smashing the nose fuse against the limestone wall with as much force as he could generate. The impact made a dull metallic crunch. He felt the striker mechanism give way inside the fuse. The shell was armed. He turned toward the entrance, rose into a crouch and threw. The shell tumbled through the air in a high arc, tail fins rotating, and hit the ground 15 meters from the tomb directly in front of the advancing Japanese line. The explosion was enormous, far larger than a grenade. A great rising bloom of orange fire and black smoke that lit up the entire slope. The concussion rolled back over the tomb and Anderson felt it in his chest, in his teeth. He dropped below the entrance and reached for the second shell. He had no time to think about what he was doing, no time to reconsider. The noise outside had changed. The Japanese were shouting, confusion in their voices, and the steady advance had faltered. Anderson armed the second shell, stood, and threw again. This one fell short, detonating in a shallow depression 8 meters out, but the fragments sang through the darkness and someone screamed. He armed a third shell and threw it further, aiming for the muzzle flashes he could see winking in the grass. The explosion silenced them. His right shoulder was already aching from the strain. Each throw required his full strength, a baseball pitcher's windup compressed into a single violent motion, and the limestone wall punished his knuckles every time he struck the fuse. His hand was bleeding freely now, blood slicking the metal, but he could not stop to wrap it. He armed the fourth shell and threw it high, trying for distance, and it detonated midair 10 meters above the slope, an airburst that sent fragments ripping downward in a lethal cone. He heard men crying out, heard the sound of bodies hitting the ground. Leland was staring at him with an expression somewhere between horror and disbelief. Hastings had stopped praying. Dominguez whispered, "Jesus Christ," over and over, a rosary of profanity. Anderson ignored them. He armed the fifth shell, threw it, armed the sixth, threw it. The rhythm was mechanical now, brutally simple. Strike, throw, strike, throw. Do not think about the fuse. Do not think about the explosion radius. Do not think about the fact that you are holding a live bomb inches from your face. The seventh shell detonated too close. Anderson had misjudged the angle, thrown it too steeply, and it came down just beyond the entrance, maybe 12 meters out. The blast wave hit him like a physical blow, hurling him backward into the tomb. He struck the floor hard, ears ringing, and for a moment he could not see anything except bright afterimages floating in the darkness. Something wet was running down his left leg. He reached down and felt the tear in his trousers, felt the warmth spreading, and understood in a detached, distant way that he had been hit. Shrapnel. Thigh. Bad, but not arterial. Not yet. He forced himself upright. His leg screamed in protest, but it held his weight. He could still move. That was all that mattered. He limped back to the crate, pulled out the eighth shell, and armed it. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline or blood loss or simple exhaustion, and when he struck the fuse against the wall he nearly dropped the shell. He caught it, steadied himself, and threw. The explosion walked further down the slope, catching a cluster of shapes trying to flank around the western edge of the tomb. They scattered, and he armed the ninth shell. The Japanese attack was breaking. Anderson could feel it more than see it, a change in the quality of the noise, the rhythm of the gunfire. They had expected to overwhelm a single isolated position with speed and numbers, and instead they were being hit with indirect fire, explosions dropping out of the darkness with no apparent source, no warning. They could not see Anderson in the tomb's entrance. They did not understand what was happening, and that confusion was killing them. He threw the 10th shell, the 11th, the 12th. Each one struck and detonated and sent fragments tearing through flesh and bone. His shoulder was numb now, a deep ache that extended down his entire arm, and his wounded leg was stiffening, the muscle cramping around the shrapnel. He could feel blood pooling in his boot. The tomb stank of cordite and sweat and something worse, something copper and organic. He did not look down at his leg. There was nothing to see that would help. The 13th shell misfired. Anderson armed it, threw it, and watched it tumble lazily through the air without detonating. It hit the ground and rolled to a stop, a dud. He cursed, grabbed the 14th shell, and threw it harder than any before, putting everything he had left into the motion. It flew in a flat arc and detonated behind a limestone outcropping where several Japanese soldiers had taken cover. The explosion was muffled, but he heard the screams. Behind him, Leland had started firing again, using a rifle he had scavenged from somewhere, and Hastings had finally managed to throw his grenade, and Dominguez was shouting something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer or a battle cry. They were helping, adding their fire to the chaos Anderson had created, and maybe that was what tipped the balance, that collective refusal to die quietly. Or maybe it was simply the mathematics of casualties. The Japanese had lost too many men too quickly, and whoever was commanding them down there in the darkness had made the calculation that pressing the attack would result in total annihilation. Either way, the result was the same. The 15th shell was difficult. His right hand could barely grip the tail fins, blood and sweat making the metal slippery, and when he struck the fuse against the wall his knuckles split open. He felt the bone underneath. He threw anyway, and the shell detonated mid-slope, and the Japanese line finally broke. He could see them retreating now, pulling back down the ridge in disorder, dragging their wounded, and his vision was swimming, but he reached for the 16th shell because the job was not finished, because they might regroup, because stopping now meant dying later. He armed the last shell and stepped fully outside the tomb for the first time. The night air was cold on his face. He could see the entire slope below him, cratered and smoking, littered with dark shapes that did not move. He drew his arm back one final time and threw the shell as far as his failing strength would allow. It arced high, tumbling end over end, and fell among the retreating Japanese soldiers. The explosion was distant, almost gentle, a soft orange flower blooming in the darkness. Anderson collapsed against the tomb's entrance, his legs giving out, and slid down until he was sitting in the dirt. His right arm hung useless at his side. His left leg was soaked with blood from hip to ankle. He could hear Leland talking to him, asking him something, but the words were muffled and strange. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were destroyed. The skin flayed back in strips, the knuckles visible as white bone beneath the red mess. He had thrown 16 mortar shells by hand. He had armed them by striking live fuses against stone. He had done it while wounded, in darkness, with enemy infantry 10 meters away. He had killed more than 24 men in 17 minutes using a weapon system that was never designed to be used that way, that no training manual covered, that no sane soldier would ever attempt. And the ridge was still theirs. American artillery arrived 20 minutes later, distant batteries firing pre-planned concentrations into the valleys below Kakazu, and the Japanese did not attack again that night. A corpsman reached Anderson's position just before midnight, guided up the slope by Leland, and he cut away the trouser leg and packed the wound with sulfa powder and gauze. The shrapnel had missed the femoral artery by less than 2 centimeters. Half an inch different and Anderson would have bled out in the tomb, unconscious, while the defensive line collapsed around him. The corpsman looked at Anderson's hands and said nothing, just wrapped them in bandages and injected morphine directly into the vein. Anderson barely felt the needle. They carried him down on a stretcher at dawn, moving carefully over the broken ground, and he watched the ridge recede above him, the tomb's dark entrance disappearing among the coral outcroppings. Somewhere up there were 16 impact craters and the scattered remains of a Japanese assault force that had learned too late that desperation breeds innovation. The story spread through the division in a matter of hours, passed from unit to unit with the peculiar velocity of combat legend. And by the time Anderson reached the field hospital, his name was already attached to an act that would be studied, debated, and ultimately prohibited in every subsequent revision of the Army's explosives handling protocols. The field hospital was a collection of tents erected in a muddy depression behind the American lines, organized chaos staffed by doctors and nurses who had not slept in days. Anderson was triaged, assessed as stable despite significant blood loss, and placed on a cot in a tent that smelled of disinfectant and gangrene. A surgeon removed the shrapnel from his thigh in a procedure that took 40 minutes and required no anesthetic beyond what the morphine provided. The fragment was roughly the size of a pencil eraser, jagged and irregular, and the surgeon dropped it into a metal pan with a sound like a coin falling. He said Anderson was lucky. He said it twice, as if repetition would make it more believable. Anderson's hands required more extensive treatment. The repeated impacts against limestone had fractured bones in 3 fingers, torn ligaments in his wrist, and stripped the skin from his knuckles down to the subcutaneous tissue. A different surgeon, a captain from New Jersey who spoke with the calm precision of someone explaining a recipe, reconstructed what he could and told Anderson that he would probably regain full function in 6 months if infection did not set in. Infection was always the caveat. In the Pacific, infection killed more men than bullets. The official report credited Technical Sergeant Buford T. Anderson with 25 confirmed enemy killed and the successful defense of a critical position against overwhelming force. The number was conservative, based on body counts conducted the following morning by an engineer detail that swept the slope with mine detectors and counted the dead where they lay. Some of the bodies were incomplete. Some were buried under rubble. The actual number was almost certainly higher, but the Army preferred documented evidence to speculation, and 25 was what the witnesses could verify. It was enough. The Medal of Honor citation would use words like valor and devotion to duty, and it would mention the grenades and the mortar shells but not the specific mechanics of what he did, not the blood-slick metal or the shattered knuckles or the simple arithmetic of death at close range. Anderson received the medal 9 months later in a ceremony he attended on crutches, his hands still bandaged, and he accepted it with the same quiet discomfort that characterized the rest of his public life. He never spoke about Kakazu Ridge except in the briefest terms. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. He returned to civilian life and worked as a civil servant and raised a family and avoided any situation that might require him to explain why he had done something so spectacularly reckless that it had saved 40 men and broken an enemy battalion's will to fight. There were reasons for his silence, though he never articulated them publicly. Part of it was simple humility, the reflexive discomfort that many combat veterans feel when asked to recount actions taken under circumstances that defy comfortable explanation. Part of it was survivor's guilt, the knowledge that other men had done equally brave things and died in obscurity, their names forgotten, their sacrifices recorded only in casualty reports filed in dusty archives. And part of it, perhaps the largest part, was the understanding that what he had done on Kakazu Ridge was not heroism in any traditional sense but rather a desperate improvisation born of exhaustion and fear and the absolute unwillingness to let his squad die in a limestone tomb on a meaningless ridge on an island most Americans could not locate on a map. Heroism suggested intention, purpose, moral clarity. Anderson had simply been trying to survive the next 5 minutes, and then the 5 minutes after that, and the fact that his survival had required him to violate every safety protocol in the Army's explosives manual did not make him a hero. It made him lucky. The tactic itself died with the battle. No military in the world trains soldiers to throw live mortar shells. The risk is too great, the margin for error too narrow, the probability of catastrophic failure too high. Modern explosive safety protocols classify such an action as gross negligence, grounds for court-martial in peacetime. But on a dark ridge in Okinawa in April 1945, when the only alternative was annihilation, one exhausted sergeant looked at a crate of useless ammunition and saw a way forward. He calculated the odds and accepted them. He broke every rule because the rules no longer applied. And he lived. The limestone tomb still exists, unmarked and forgotten among the ridges of southern Okinawa. The crate is long gone, the spent shell casings removed by salvage teams in the summer of 1945, but the rock face inside the tomb still bears the marks, 16 impact points where steel fuses struck limestone and the ordinary physics of high explosive were bent to the service of survival. If you visit the site today, which almost no one does, you can place your hand against those marks and feel the texture of desperation made permanent. You can imagine the weight of the shells, the stink of the blood, the mathematics of throwing distance versus blast radius. You can try to picture what it would take to do what Anderson did. Most people find that they cannot. War is not a metaphor. It is a sequence of specific physical actions undertaken by terrified human beings who want very badly to continue living. Sometimes those actions align with doctrine and training. Sometimes they require improvisation. And very rarely, in circumstances so extreme that they resist comfortable narration, they require a willingness to hold death in your hands and throw it at someone else before it kills you first. That is what happened on Kakazu Ridge. That is what one man did when the ammunition ran out and the enemy kept coming and the only weapon left was the one nobody was supposed to use. If you found this account compelling, consider subscribing to this channel. There are other stories from the Pacific War, equally detailed and equally human, waiting to be told with the care they deserve. If this narrative affected you, a like helps others find it. And here is the question I want you to consider, the one I think Anderson himself spent 50 years trying to answer. When the rules designed to keep you alive no longer apply, when the choice is between impossible action and certain death, what separates heroism from madness? Is it the outcome, the intention, the fact that you survived to be judged? Or is it something simpler and more troubling, the recognition that under sufficient pressure, any of us might pick up that first shell and strike it against the stone, and in doing so cross a threshold that can never be recrossed? Think about that. Then tell me what you believe.